And joining us now on the debate, in Tucson, Arizona, Lane Kenworthy. He's a professor of sociology and political science at the University of Arizona. In Washington, D.C., Scott Winship, fellow at the Brookings Institution. With us here in studio, Angelo DeCaro, National Communications Representative for the Canadian Auto Workers Union, Richard Warzel, author and futurist, and we're happy to welcome back author Andrew McAfee in San Francisco, California. Good to have you two guys here in the studio, and to our friends in Points Beyond in the United States. Lane, I want to start with you. Let's tackle this for starters. Do you believe we are facing a complete restructuring of work because of digital technological breakthroughs?
I think it's too soon to say. I think the book makes a compelling argument, but on the other hand, as Andrew said earlier, these predictions have been around for quite some time, and they haven't quite come to pass yet. So one can point at the evidence in the United States from the early 2000s, where even during an upturn of the business cycle, there wasn't much job creation, at least compared to previous decades. And of course, now we're mired in a slump from which we haven't yet pulled out of. Employment's begun to increase ever so slightly, but there's a very long way to go. So one can read the evidence coupled with the very compelling hypothesis that there's reason to expect that there may be fewer jobs for humans as technology, robots, computers get better and better and better, and draw that conclusion. But there are other hypotheses about why, for example, after 2000 up to 2007, before the crash hit, why there wasn't much employment growth. There's the China story, which refers to huge growth in employment in China, some of which surely came at the expense of what would have been a rebound in manufacturing employment here in the United States. And there are other arguments about, for example, a change in the culture of management attitudes, the sort of spreading of the downsizing craze, coupled with change incentives for CEOs due to the fact that a lot of their payouts increasingly came from stock options, which are dependent on the price of the company's stock. And so if Wall Street likes lean and mean, likes few employees, then CEOs and upper management have an incentive not to hire even when times are good, and to lay off more when times aren't so good. So yeah, I think it's a compelling argument, but I really do think it's too soon to tell.
Richard, where are you on this? There's a compelling argument, but more to tell as well?
I think that part of the problem is there's more than one thing going on. We are seeing a recovery from a cyclical downturn, which is very prolonged for a variety of reasons, mostly because the crash was financial in nature, and that takes a long time to recover from. But as well, I think there's a secular trend, a long-term trend, which is also going on, which is the rise of the machines, which is the replacement of work by automation. I mean, we've seen this for a long time. You go to a gas station, you don't have a gas jockey come out and pump your gas most of the time anymore. You do it yourself, and you swipe your card and you pay yourself and you leave. In your own studio, you can see these sort of things. Like, I can write music, I can score it, I can perform it with a computer, without instruments, without musicians. I can create a movie with my digital camera. I can edit it online on my laptop. And I can put the music together. I can create my own movie. One person, without the scores of people that used to be required.
But someone had to invent all that stuff for you to be able to do it.
Absolutely, but it's invented now. Yeah. And one of the things that Andrew was saying earlier was that what we're seeing is a compounding effect in the advance of technology. Well, that's wrong. In fact, that's too conservative, because
Let's just explain that. He talked about Moore's Law, which says basically technology is going to redouble itself every 18 months. You think that's too conservative?
Well, he referenced Ray Kurzweil. Kurzweil has been tracking the change in technology since the beginning of the 20th century. And he finds that not only is the rate of change accelerating, but the rate of acceleration is increasing. So that today, computers are doubling in speed and halving in price about every 10 to 11 months, not every 18 months.
Scott, let me put this to you. You tell us, I think I've seen in your work, that in this recession, there are 3 to 5 unemployed Americans competing for each job opening, which is a much higher average than has been the case traditionally throughout history. At the same time, let me read this to you. This is from Doug Oberhelman, the CEO of Caterpillar, who says there is no economic law that says that everyone, or even most people, automatically benefit from technological progress. What do you think about that, Scott?
Well, I think that's right. I agree in general with what Lane said, that it's kind of too soon to tell. One thing that I think is worth remembering is that the impact of technology on the workforce may not actually come in the form of employment or unemployment. It may come in the form of wages and inequality. And the reason that I say that, it's true that job growth during the 2000s was weak by historical standards. But it's also true that the labor force grew much slower than in previous decades. And so what you really want to do is to compare the growth of employment and jobs against the growth in the labor force. And that's exactly what the change in the unemployment rate does. And when you look at that, the 2000s actually look as good as the 1990s did, surprisingly, even when you include the Great Recession years in that average. And they look better than the 1970s and the 1980s. So in some ways, I think focusing on the rate of job growth is the wrong thing to do in this case. All that said, I think there's a lot more evidence to indicate that technological advances have increased the wages of people who have more education, skills that are in higher demand, and that we do see this great divergence in incomes over the last 30 or 40 years. And to my mind, that's the most compelling evidence of how continued technological innovation is going to impact the economy and workers.
I'm going to put my next quote here to you, Angelo, and in doing so, I'm going to do a mea culpa first. You may have noticed that in our efforts to use less paper around this place, we now have the questions on both sides of the page, which means that every now and then, I forget to flip the page and I read the wrong quote. And guess what? I just did that. So, what Doug Oberhelmer of Caterpillar actually said, and I bet Andrew was thinking, wait a second, I think I said that in my book. Why is he quoting Doug on that? Yes, Andrew, that last quote was you. Here's what, and this is actually better to put to the CAW representative here today. He said, and I sure hope I got it right this time, we cannot find qualified hourly production people, and for that matter, many technical engineering service technicians, and even welders. And it is hurting our manufacturing base in the United States. The education system in the United States basically has failed them, and we have to retrain every person we hire. Those are your folks, pretty much, that we're talking about right there. Speak to that, if you would.
Well, yeah, I think the thesis behind this is interesting. I think that obviously technology has played a tremendous role in redefining, reconceptualizing the manufacturing sector in particular, most goods-producing sectors. I can't help but think of the role that robotics have played in revolutionizing the productivity levels of auto plants, for that matter. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, is often underreported, I guess, is the tremendous amount of job loss that ensued from the introduction of robotics. But it's also something worth noting that, at least from the union's perspective, we've understood technology not getting in the way of it, per se. But technology had a promise to it, and the promise was that there was opportunities for productivity gains and possibly for even fewer work hours in the day. And so there's kind of a sense of a bargain, if you will, between employers and employers in this case. But what we've seen over the years is clearly that that's not been the case, and we've seen productivity skyrocket.
Well, sorry, what hasn't been the case? Productivity surely happened.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the sharing in those benefits that hasn't been the case. And so what we've seen is, rather than, say, reduced work time, bettering our members' lives, many workers' lives in manufacturing, we've seen incredible amounts of job losses. We've seen the gutting out, effectively, of the manufacturing sector, where in Canada today, it accounts for less than 10% of the economy. It's unheard of. And so when you think of all the possibilities of what properly managed technological investments could have brought to workers, we just clearly haven't seen that.
Let me get Andrew to react to that comment from the head of Caterpillar. With all of the jobs that people need filled, he can't get people to fill the jobs that he has. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense, and I hear that over and over from business leaders that I talk to. And to tie together a few of the recent comments, what's going on are two of the fairly well understood patterns in recent economic history. The first is what we've called skill-biased technical change. In other words, as technology advances, it tends to put a premium on higher skills and different skills, and to make obsolete some of the skills that were important before. So the bundle of skills and abilities you need to work in a manufacturing facility, a cutting-edge one today, are night and day different than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So a lot of the companies can't find workers with the appropriate bundle of skill these days. The other main phenomenon that we're noticing, and this goes to the comment Angelo just made, is that the share of the benefits or the overall economic gains going to capital as opposed to labor is shifting quite a lot. And what we see over and over is that capital is taking home more and more of the gains from each round of progress and productivity gain, leaving less and less for labor.
As you look at this then, Richard, I know that, what was it, 1994, I guess you did that book, Facing the Future?
Yes.
You dealt with a lot of these issues?
That's correct.
How have, I mean, and this is a decade and a half now, almost 2 decades ago that you wrote that. How's the prognosticating from that book looking today?
It looks very good. I didn't know when it was going to happen, but it was very clear to me that it was going to happen. I look out at the next 10 years, and what I see now is we are going to see the emergence of what might be described as everyday robots. In other words, robots not bolted to the floor of a car factory, but robots that we encounter in our everyday lives, and computer intelligences that impinge on our everyday lives, like Siri from the iPhone. And it's going to happen more and more. There is already pattern recognition software based on genetic programming, which is a type of software approach, that is now looking for drugs for oncology, for cancer, and doing a better job in many cases than humans are able to do. This is going to be a continuing theme that we are going, it's not that there aren't new jobs being created. There are two issues that are going on though. First of all, the jobs that are being created at the top with the highest levels of education and mentation and creativity required. And secondly, the rate of change of new jobs is accelerating, so that even if you are in demand today, you might be obsolete tomorrow and then be thrown back in the pool of people who are throwing out resumes and desperately looking for work.
I need Lane to explain this to us because you work at a post-secondary institution and there are millions of people attending fine post-secondary institutions across North America. Are the people who staff these organizations not kind of preparing people for the jobs that are out there adequately enough?
Well, there's always going to be some slippage as societies transform, as you move from one sector to another. And so, of course, universities provide a lot in the way of general skills. They also provide specific skills. Some of those specific skills will be well suited for the demand that comes in the ensuing 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Some won't be so much because it's very hard to predict these things. General skills, you hope, will enable people to adapt to all kinds of changes. I want to say I fully agree that whatever the effects on the quantity of employment and also on the particular type of employment, and this is something I want to come back to in just a second if I can, it's, I think, certainly true that societies are shifting. The rich countries like the United States and Canada are shifting to a situation where people are going to need to be more adaptable in terms of changing jobs, even changing careers, maybe 1, 2, or more times. Of course, people have always done that. Some people have always done it, but I think it's going to be more necessary. And that's where general skills do come in. That starts from the beginning, from preschool all the way up through university. It's not just university.
Angelo?
Maybe I'll hold off on the point about the type of jobs and we can come back to
Okay, yes, because I think we are going to come to that in a little bit. Angelo, at a recent union gathering, you talked about the acceleration in our economy right now to something you called, and I'd not heard this expression before, precarious work. Absolutely. What percentage of people who work in our province, country, continent, do you think are involved in precarious work now?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to be clear, I guess, firstly, is what exactly that is. This is, I guess, an alternative theory behind some of the income inequality we've seen. And it has, less to do with technological advancements necessarily as it does the changing structure of the employment relationship, and that's brought on by a whole host of factors. Effectively, precarious work is work that offers instability beyond stability. It offers uncertainty. It's work that can be classified in various ways: part-time work, forced part-time work where full-time work isn't on offer. Work that creates new brokerages where there's third parties who have to be the liaison between you and an employer. It breaks down those traditional structures. And that's something that, at least for the last 30 years, we've seen growing pretty substantially in Canada and throughout the world.
Any guess what percentage of people are involved in that?
Absolutely. Right now, about 1/3 of all workers could be classified as precariously employed in Canada.
But that's the new normal.
It's becoming the new, yeah, I would argue that. It's becoming the new normal, absolutely.
You may not like it, but that's the way it is.
Definitely not, but that's the way it is.
And Andrew, is there anything we should want to do about that?
Well, we know, first of all, that people don't like it. Jim Clifton, who's the CEO of Gallup, the polling organization, just wrote a book called The Coming Jobs War, and he makes these striking statements. He polled people around the world, and he said the will of the world is not most of the things that we'd think. It's not democracy, it's not religious freedom, it's not owning your home, it's not this laundry list of stuff that we think people hold dear. The will of the world, according to him, is a good old-fashioned steady job, where you know the number of hours you're going to work per week, you know the pay that you're going to get. The point that he makes, though, is that there's a gap between the number of people who want that kind of job and the number of jobs available around the world, about 1.8 billion, and that gap is getting bigger instead of smaller. So the question is, man, what do we do about this? Unfortunately, my philosophy is that when we head into a time of great uncertainty in so many different ways, the way to respond to that is not with rigidity, not by trying to nail parts of the workforce of the economy down. We have to respond with fluidity and with opening up for experimentation and innovation. I think the precariousness does go along with that, though.
Scott, let me bring you back in here because we know that Americans love their rags to riches stories, and we know the whole notion of upward mobility is, I mean, that's such an integral part of the American dream. And yet if you look at things today, you know, that American dream is more likely to be lived in Canada or, God forbid, in socialist Sweden, not so much in the United States anymore. Is your country losing the ability to have that dream?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question. I think first of all, you're right. By most of the measures that are out there, you're much more likely, if you start at the bottom in particular, to advance out of the bottom as an adult yourself in Canada, in the UK, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries. So my favorite statistic on this is if you just compare the U.S. and Canada, which, you know, I think residents of both countries, the two countries are a lot more alike than different than I think either side would like to admit. But on mobility, there's a very real difference. If you are growing up and your dad has twice the income of your next door neighbor, say, in Canada, you and your next door neighbor, when you grow up, your incomes will differ by about 25%. The one who has the richer dad will have an income that's about 25% more than the one who has the poorer dad. In the U.S., it's not 25%; it's 60%. So that's a pretty dramatic difference. Now, all that said, these measures tend to look at whether you end up on the same part of the income ladder as your parents. Another way to think about mobility is just to think about absolute income gains. So, you know, compared to what your parents had, regardless of if they were at the top or the bottom, and regardless of whether you end up at the top or the bottom, are you better off or worse off, and by how much? There's actually no good evidence on that. My former employer, the Pew Economic Mobility Project, is working on this question right now, and hopefully they'll have an answer soon. But if absolute mobility is actually more important to Americans, and I think there's some evidence that it could be, then it may be that the American dream is actually alive and well in terms of what matters most.
Lane, I wonder sorry, let me just jump in for Lane for a second. I wonder if this is a good moment for you to revisit that point you were going to make about the jobs just a few moments ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is slightly different from what Scott was just discussing, but the other side of the job creation story, if in fact we're moving toward a much more bifurcated jobs or labor market, is that there are an awful lot of jobs that have been in the last generation and probably for the foreseeable future, and I think Andrew, at least the way I read the book, would agree with this, that are on the low end of the scale, both in terms of the skills required and also in terms of the pay, and in addition, things like job security and probably benefits, depending on what country you live in. So I think a really important question, if in fact there are going to be an awful lot of these jobs, is what the work conditions in them are like, and what kind of wages they get paid. And also whether or not the wages increase over time. I mean, it's one thing to have low wages, it's another thing to have low wages stick for a generation, which is essentially, apart from a brief period in the late 1990s, the story of the United States over the last generation. It's nearly unique, although I think something not too dissimilar has occurred in Canada. I don't know the wage data as well. But this, to me, is as worrisome or more than the prospects of computers and robots slowing down the rate of job growth. I think it's a real conundrum that we face, and something that education alone isn't going to solve.
Angelo.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the interesting things that happened recently is in 2008, we saw for the first time in Canadian history, at least with terms of our industrial landscape, retail jobs surpassed manufacturing jobs as the main source of employment for the average Canadian. And that was really symbolic. It was very telling. Retail work has become sort of the driver of employment in Canada. And it's unfortunate because it goes to that point about it being mired in low wages. And I guess interestingly, we can have a discussion about the role that technology plays in the retail sector. One example that I came across recently, which I thought was quite interesting, is a chain of United States supermarkets who, like most supermarkets in North America and around the world for that matter, have gone to automated checkouts. And they've made a conscious decision based on a number of different reasons, including consumer preference, is that they're actually going to pull those automated checkouts because people would prefer the actual human interaction. So I'm not suggesting that dispels the theory here, but I think it's an interesting take on it.
You're going to forgive this follow-up here, but are you as concerned about the fact that retail work has surpassed manufacturing work because, frankly, you have more people unionized in manufacturing than you do in the retail sector?
Yeah, increasingly that's becoming the opposite too. I mean, we do represent quite a number of retail workers, and some retail workers, for that matter, are unionized. And I think it's not so much the issue of the work per se. It's that it's this type of work. It's the work that's become expected in that sector. It's just inherently low wage. It tends to exploit younger people who are looking for jobs, and that's what they get. Seniors as well. New Canadians. So I think there's a lot of issues around it, including wages. Having more retail workers than manufacturing is not doing any justice, at least to building a middle class in Canada.
Richard wants in.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I'd like to pick up on is a point that Angela made earlier, and that is that retail is inherently precarious work, as opposed to steady manufacturing jobs which paid well and had good benefits. And we are moving increasingly towards that sort of precarious work. And part of the reason is that the routine work, that the steady manufacturing jobs are being increasingly done by automation. As automation becomes more powerful, and the projections are over the next 10 years that computers are going to become 1,000 times more powerful, then the automation, robots and computer intelligence is going to eat their way up the food chain and create and replace more of these steady jobs, and we're going to be left with service jobs that are inherently precarious. And I don't see it as a stable model for society. And something that Lane said earlier about having general skills as opposed to specific skills are going to be very important. Part of the problem, though, is that employers are looking for very specific skills that they hire for. So we have a market where there are jobs going begging. At the same time, we have people begging for jobs.
Andrew, you looked like you had a follow-up there, and maybe as you think about how you want to respond to that, I might also ask you, this phenomenon that we're discussing here, is this an American thing or does this go around the world?
So I've been listening to us talk about the wage stagnation, which is absolutely real and something to be concerned about, and about the precariousness, which is absolutely going on as well. But I want to be careful that no one listening starts to think about technology as the bad guy or some evil being done to our economy or society, because I just don't believe that's the case at all. And to go back to the discussion a bit earlier about absolute improvement in standards of living, there is some ambiguity in the data, but it's also true that if you look at the quality and quantity of goods available to the average person today, in a lot of ways, and I'm not exaggerating here, it would stagger the imagination of the Rockefellers. We have so much abundance in any dimension that we look, particularly when we look at anything like an information good. The amount of information we can consume, we can produce, our entertainment and media options, these would blow people away. I heard a quote a little while back, I don't know if it's quite accurate or not, that the average person today has ready access to more information than the President of the United States did 20 years ago. I don't have too much trouble believing that. So I want to be one of the guys sticking up for technology here. The last thing I want to do is make any attempt to slow down or retard the pace of technical progress. One of the quotes we put in our book is from the physicist Freeman Dyson, who says that technology is a gift of God. After the gift of life, it's the greatest gift. It is the mother of arts and sciences and civilization. I want to make sure that viewpoint comes through loud and clear in this program.
No, fair enough, and we hear you loud and clear. But Lane, maybe you could follow up on that by telling us whether you think education is similarly a gift of God and whether more of it will get us through this.
Let me first just make one very brief point. Well, I almost completely agree with what Andrew just said. I think it's critical to distinguish between now versus the late 1800s or early 1900s with the Rockefellers and others, and we surely are in many ways at immensely higher living standards. That's true from top to bottom in the income distribution. On the other hand, if we compare now versus, let's say, the mid to late 1970s, while it's true that we now have iPods and iPhones and access to the internet, which surely have improved quality of life and living standards, there it gets a little sketchier as to how much and in exactly what ways material living standards have improved. And in the United States, at least, when we speak about wages and to some extent incomes are a slightly different story, but the growth, the improvement has been quite slow. I would argue a good bit slower than we'd like. Now, in terms of education, I'll just make one quick simple point. So education is a very commonly cited remedy for problems of finding a job and getting better pay. And if you compare across individuals within any country at any given point in time, there's a very strong correlation. The more years of schooling you completed, the better your pay tends to be. When we look at a societal level, so people then translate that into a recommendation that, well, the solution for our ills in terms of better access to jobs and higher pay as a society, as a country, is just to educate more people. Well, when you look over time, at least in the last generation, among the rich countries, there's not nearly as clear a correlation. It's simply not clear that what distinguishes among individuals at a given point in time in a society is also the remedy for a society as a whole.
Richard, you want to follow up?
Absolutely. Part of the reason why that's the case, that just education is not enough, is it has to be the right kind of education. And I don't mean a specific skill set. I mean that we have to teach creativity and innovation. The things that machines cannot do are the creative things, are the intuitive things, are the interpersonal things. Like your job is not at risk of being replaced by a robot because what you do is intuit what your panelists are about to say and how they interact. Your job is new and fresh every day. But somebody behind the scenes operating a camera or even coming up with the story ideas, that may be capable of being automated.
Am I allowed to say God forbid on that?
You can say it.
And I'll tell you something. I mean, since you're on it, we have one of the very few current affairs shows left probably in North America where we actually have people behind the cameras.
That's right.
Because we find they bring something different and it's important that they bring it.
But when you sorry.
But I digress.
No, you're absolutely right. But one of the things that we have to address is the fact that our education system, particularly at the primary and secondary levels, teaches in a model which is fundamentally 19th century. We are teaching rote learning. And in the internet age where I can look up any fact that I want, rote learning is a very limited value. What we do need is understanding, being able to place facts in context, creativity, and interpersonal skills. And those are the critical issues that our education system has to be focused around. And those are the general skills that I'm inferring from what Lane said, that Lane referred to earlier.
Okay, Scott, I mean, to the extent that you've looked at this thing, do you think the post-secondary institutions of North America are, in fact, doing that which Richard has just referred to?
I don't. I think it's probably unfair to put the blame on Lane and the rest of academia. You know, there's been some evidence in the data that we're looking at the Brookings Institution. I manage a project called the Social Genome Project, where we're trying to determine the pathways that lead to success in adulthood, economic success. And one of the things we've discovered is that it's something we weren't looking for at all, but it looks like there's a pretty sizable amount of grade inflation in the data. We're looking at objective data where we've got the transcripts of nationally representative groups of kids. And so even a high school degree no longer means what it used to. And then, you know, my parents both taught secondary education, and it's unfair, I think, to put everything on them. There's been a lot more challenges at home that kids bring to school in terms of family structure, in terms of two parents working, when in the past lots of times families that preferred it that way could have one person caring for the kids. But I do think it's the case that that's really our only path forward, is to get more people prepared for school and to get them through school. In the States, it's really been a generation that we've been stuck in terms of men graduating from college. Women are still taking advantage of the clear signal that if you get a college degree, your wages will be much higher than if you don't. But we've kind of hit a ceiling for men. And unless we can change that, then I do think technological change is going to continue to increase inequality. Now, all that said,
and I think
you can also...
Andrew, come on in here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it actually is fair to point the finger at academia a bit, with my home industry, because there are some disturbing trends in that industry. First of all, it's getting much, much more expensive, at least in the States. I believe the rate of increase in higher education tuition is about 3 times the rate of inflation in recent years. There's also evidence that we're not asking the students to do as much work, or for whatever reason, they're not learning as much. There's a really disturbing study called Academically Adrift that came out recently that documented pretty carefully that close to half of undergraduate students demonstrate no measurable progress after 2 years in college, and only about a third demonstrated progress after 4 years in college. And graduation rates are dropping. So I look at a lot of the trends in the higher education industry, and I do think there are some issues there, and we do need to start asking and answering hard questions.
So Andrew, follow up with this then. What happens in the future to those who are neither creative nor entrepreneurial? What are we going to do with them?
Well, they're going to be, as we've talked about, maybe put down into one of those lower wage jobs where we still don't have automation that can do all of it. But I don't want to turn out a society that has a bunch of internet entrepreneurs at one end and a bunch of restaurant busboys at the other end, and kind of this vast depopulated middle ground. That sounds like a bad outcome to me.
Angela, how does it look to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's a lot to be concerned about with respect to that. I think that assuming that we can rely on increasingly the bulk of individuals working in low-wage sectors, there's a couple things that can happen. One is you see a decline of a middle class, and we talk a lot about the education system. Unless we can start explaining how robots can pay taxes, I'm not sure where that takes our education system effectively, right? But there's also social problems with that. And I think, you know, not to overstate it, but I think that for a lot of folks in the next generation of workers, folks that are just graduating out of colleges and universities now, they're seeing a bleak future. And I think it comes to a point where we can't look so forward to assume that the world absent workers, the world completely automated. There are social consequences to that. There are social consequences to not having enough good jobs. And I think before we get to the fully automated world of science fiction, I think that we're going to have to deal with a bit of social unrest before then.
That's going to be my home stretch question, so hang in there for a second. Richard, you want to
I
add?
was actually going to tackle that, so maybe I shouldn't. But fundamentally, if we go down that route, we're headed towards revolution. And if that sounds too far out, I would point to the Occupy Wall Street movement as a perfect illustration of the unrest. This is really the first major protest against capitalism since the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's happening because of the lack of jobs. That is where we're headed, and it concerns me greatly.
With just a few minutes left here, let me read this by Vasily Leontief in Policy Options, who wrote, Adam and Eve enjoyed, before they were expelled from paradise, a high standard of living without working. After their expulsion, they and their successors were condemned to eke out a miserable existence working from dawn to dusk. The history of technological progress over the past 200 years is essentially the story of the human species working its way slowly and steadily back into paradise. What would happen, however, if we suddenly found ourselves in it? With all the goods and services provided without work, no one would be gainfully employed. Being unemployed means receiving no wages. As a result, until appropriate new income policies were formulated to fit the changed technological conditions, everyone would starve in paradise. Lane, start us off on this. How are we to think about a world where machines do all the work? Is that paradise or is that a nightmare?
I think a lot depends on whether there's a cleavage in society. If we were to actually, in some future century, get to a situation where nobody needed to do much work, I don't know. I'm a little worried, but I wouldn't worry. I would worry a lot less than I would about a society in which 40% work and the rest have no jobs, or 60% work and the rest have no jobs. And a lot of those that don't have jobs want them. I also, I should say, worry a good bit about a society in which some work, whether it's 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, and get paid really well or quite well, and their incomes are going up over time, and others who aren't getting paid so well and their incomes are stagnating. Even if they have more technological gadgets and robots can do more of the sort of drudgery work that they need done to make their lives happy. I think that's the kind of situation that's really problematic for society, and I think that's where we need to think seriously about new policies or expansion of existing ones that can try to ameliorate those kinds of conditions.
Richard?
Yeah, one thing I want to pick up on on what Lane said. Lane, you said that if we got to a situation where you had 40% of people unemployed or 40% of people not in secure work, in a sense, we're already approaching that. The unemployment rate in the United States is 9%, the official unemployment rate. If you add in the people that have dropped out of the labor force and therefore aren't counted, and you include those people who are underemployed, and you look at men, particularly minorities, you have unemployment rates that are approaching 40% now.
40?
Yes.
That's frightening. That is frightening. Okay, 2 minutes to go here. You want to bring us home on this one, Andrew? What's your view? Is that paradise or is that a nightmare, the scenario I've just described?
We have the choice about what it's going to look like. I think the favorite quote that we came across when we were writing the book was from Voltaire, who said that work saves us from 3 great evils: boredom, vice, and need. And we're concentrating on the need question right now for a lot of great reasons. Let's say we can fix that, and we can, because we have, in America, it's an incredibly wealthy, still growing society, so we can put in place policies to make sure that no one needs to starve. I don't say we have all those policies right now, but we could do that. That still leaves us with the boredom and the vice question, and as a lot of us have been saying, there is unrest, there is precariousness, there are social ills associated with joblessness. So we have time to figure this out, because as we've said, the robots are not going to take all of our jobs tomorrow, but we had better start focusing on this issue quite quickly.
Are we?
You know, I think like a lot of us, like almost everyone I talk to, I look at what's going on in Washington and I see gridlock and I get absolutely dismayed by it. I go talk to other groups, and as we've heard today, we are focused on different aspects of this question. We are concerned on it. I hope that things like the Occupy movement and the Tea Party and other things will finally send a signal to our representatives that we don't want gridlock, we don't want heads to butt, we want people to work on figuring out the next chapter of our economy and society, because the chapter is changing.
Gotcha. Thanks, everybody, for a great discussion on this. Quite fascinating. To Lane Kenworthy, the sociologist at the University of Arizona in our Tucson studio. Scott Winship, the fellow at the Brookings Institution in our Washington studio. Here in our studios in Toronto, Angelo Di Caro. I gave you a really Italian pronunciation there, Angelo. National representative from the CAW. There's Richard Warzel, the futurist. And once again, the guy who got it all started for us tonight, Andrew McAfee, on the line from San Francisco, California, co-author of Race Against the Machine. He's the principal research scientist at the MIT Center for Digital Business as well. Thanks so much, everybody. Great to talk to you.